This video is primarily for pupils from Christ Hospital School. The aim of these videos is to give you a different way to fill in notes and make notes on the various topics on the A2 course in a way that you can pause. There won't be any great special effects, I'm afraid, and certainly there won't be any pictures of me. This video is on the topic of macroeconomic objectives of government. Most of this should be very familiar from the AS course. So there are several macroeconomic objectives that governments aim for. Really here we are looking at a macroeconomic score sheet for a country. We talk about objectives of government, but never be trapped into thinking these are necessarily things which improve from more government intervention. Like it or not though, the government, certainly since the days of Keynes after the Second World War, feels responsible for the conduct of macroeconomic policy and the outcomes of macroeconomic variables too. What are the most important economic variables to measure success, if you like, for the British economy? Well, the most important one is development, which comes from having, at the very least, high and stable growth. That's two objectives in one already. High growth, but also stable growth, so that there aren't too many fluctuations in what we call the business cycle of boom and recession. In order to get growth and development that is consistent with environmental aims, we need to make sure we use our resources wisely, and this is known as sustainable growth. Shown here is the Brundtland Commission definition of sustainability. The word sustainable can sometimes be used to mean sort of stable, ongoing growth as well as environmentally sustainable. You have to be a little bit careful as you read and use this word. Unless you're going to grow your population very greatly, or your land, which is unlikely unless you're pretty aggressive and warlike, the main way in which you're going to get growth, and certainly the way that you'll get growth per capita, is through productivity. This needs to be thought about and discussed a little bit further. But the second main aim as a macroeconomic variable is low inflation. This is sometimes called price stability, but in fact the UK, in common with most modern central banks, wants to have a little bit of inflation. The UK Bank of England target is 2.0% CPI. In order to analyse really what happened and what went wrong in 2008, you have to acknowledge that assets and prices went all over the place, and yet inflation as measured by the Bank of England's target measure CPI wasn't worrying. So since that crisis, people have been focused more and more on all the other financial and monetary variables as well as just consumer inflation. So financial stability, that is safe operation of the banking system, plenty of buffers for banks, is an important part of what monetary policy will be in the future. But in its simplest form, this objective is to have low inflation. Why? Well, because inflation results in a misallocation of resources. It distorts the price mechanism, meaning that supply and demand don't work as efficiently. It causes uncertainty, it punishes savers, and it rewards profligate borrowers, redistributing income from those on fixed incomes to those who can control their pay. There are also menu and shoe leather costs. Most importantly though, a little bit of inflation is not very bad, but it can lead to an increased expectation of inflation, which leads to ever higher inflation. Strato and then hyperinflation, which is the result of governments printing too much money in response to these rising inflationary expectations, is one of the most destructive economic events, or if not one of the most destructive events that can happen to a country. The next macroeconomic objective of government is full employment. Probably a better word for it would be low unemployment, because by full employment economists don't mean that everybody has a job. All they mean is that the level of unemployment is its equilibrium level, not any higher. There is no demand deficient unemployment in theory. Where the equilibrium level of unemployment, known as the natural rate or NARI rate, is a very debatable topic and hard to measure. So it's a very, very tricky concept. Yet in our theory, full employment is a really, really important idea. So we have a tricky idea here of full employment where economists think that the economy is in equilibrium. To cut a long story short though, governments would prefer there to be low unemployment. Unemployment is a bad thing. It harms those people who are unemployed, and it causes knock-on effects to society. So they want unemployment to be low, but an economist would warn them against unemployment that was so low that it was below full employment, which could cause inflationary problems. Low unemployment. The fourth macro objective is a stable balance of payments situation. I know that sounds waffly, but it doesn't necessarily mean that exports must equal imports, which would be a balance of trade as opposed to a trade deficit or trade surplus. It means that the situations that are caused by your position as an international trader of goods and services don't cause instability in your economy. If you fix your exchange rate as part of your monetary policy, let's say if we fix the pound to the value of the dollar, as we did up until the early 1970s in this country, then when there are problems with your exports or import levels, that will put pressure on the fixed exchange rate to devalue or revalue. In a fixed exchange rate regime, your economic problems show up in the balance of payments and cause a balance of payments crisis. If you have a floating exchange rate, allowing your currency to move with the forces of supply and demand on trade, then the balance of payment situation equilibrates automatically. This objective then becomes more of a measure of how well you are doing rather than a problem to be solved. The fifth macroeconomic objective is income redistribution. That means redistributing income from the rich to the poor in order to make outcomes more equal. Many people would say that that would increase fairness, but it rather depends on how the money was earned in the first place. I don't like this as a macro objective for two reasons. One is a lot of the reasons for the unequal distribution of income lie in the study of microeconomics, looking at how labour markets reward people with wages for different jobs. That's just a technical reason why I don't like it being called a macro objective of government. But the second reason is that it's normative. Not everyone agrees that equality is the same thing as fairness, and it's not clear that you can move income from one person to another without making some sort of value judgment as to whose welfare is worth more than others. Nevertheless, it's a very, very important part of macroeconomic policy, considering the distributional effects, considering the effect on the how equal income is and the effect on the rich and poor, and it's something that economists must analyse. A final objective of government, and this really isn't a macroeconomic one, is that you might have a lot of government policy that's aimed at making the microeconomy work better. In other words, ways in which markets can be made to work better through government policy. If a market isn't working well on its own, through the invisible hand, that's known as a market failure. So one area of government policy might be correcting market failure. The other thing, of course, you might think to yourself is, well, if they're doing this at a high level, let's say taxing a demerit good, then there might be macroeconomic policies of that high tax. So you might consider that, say, taxing petrol would have both a micro and macro effect. Much more interesting than that revision of AS topics is having a look now at some real data on those variables, and from that being able to talk about the state of the UK economy and European economy and world economy, but mostly from a UK perspective, I suppose, and understanding that data and making predictions. There are lots of good places that you can get this data from. I've listed quite a few here, but you're not expected to write these down. This one is a new one to me. The Google, typing into Google, they have their own data thing. The Bank of England is always very good. But the main thing is to go to my website, www.tnml.ch/eco, and from there, if you click economic data, which is a couple of links down on the left, you'll get this page and be able to use all these sources. Inflation is the sustained rise in the general level of prices. One of the macroeconomic objectives is to have stable inflation. The target for inflation since 2003 is 2.0% of the consumer price index. That means that inflation in the consumer price index should be within 1% of 2.0%. At the moment, inflation is well below that target range, but because the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England feel that this is a temporary situation, they're not panicking at the moment. Besides, with interest rates as low as they can, there is not a lot they can do. How does the Bank of England control inflation? Well, as I hinted at in the last slide, the main way is by altering the interest rate. As you can see from the period from 2005 through to 2008, the Bank of England felt it was doing a pretty good job by putting the interest rate up 0.25% here, putting it down 0.25% there, to try and keep inflation on target. And for most of the period between 1997 and 2008, when inflation targeting was used, inflation was within that target. When the recession hit in 2008, the bank immediately responded by very, very strong rate cutting. As you can see, it cut interest rates all the way down to 0.5%. The problem, and as this graph so obviously demonstrates, is that you can't cut interest rates any further. The interest rate cannot be below the rate of interest on cash, which is of course 0. It is because the economy still looks pretty deflationary around about 2009 that the government, or rather the Bank of England, started the policy of quantitative easing. Good time now to look at some recent data on inflation. Here's a fan diagram. The thicker colour indicates a higher level of probability. They would expect it to fall into the darkest red line within 30 times out of 100. The next darkest, next 30 times out of 100, and the lighter within the other 30 times out of 100, and only 10 out of 100 times could it miss the fan altogether. The prediction, not surprisingly, is eventually they'll be on target. They would say that, wouldn't they? So what are the prospects for consumer inflation in Britain? Well, Mark Carney has indicated that he does think that there's enough growth for demand to pick up in the economy, and that will put a little bit more inflationary pressure in. He's indicated that if he does put up interest rates in response to that rising inflation, he will do it gradually. He's done that so that people don't expect higher interest rates, so that they maintain a positive outlook, so that he doesn't talk down demand. The interesting thing coming out of the Bank of England at the moment is that although they think that growth will be pretty good, over the next year or two, they point to lots and lots of risks, which could mean that it isn't, and that they won't therefore need to put up interest rates and might even be facing a worrying slowdown. The 2% level of inflation is probably akin to about a 3 or 3.5% RPI level of inflation, which used to be the core measure, and the RPI measure is a little bit better at looking at long history over 50 or so years, as I have here. You can see that the low inflation of recent years is somewhat of an exception in the post-war history of the United Kingdom, certainly since about 1975, when this graph starts. Sorry about the lack of scale. The reason that you can have inflation is because you can print more money. With a strict gold standard, you can't have inflation really much faster than the rate at which gold comes into your country, which is unlikely to be very fast unless there is an enormous discovery. Since the UK left the gold standard then, inflation has periodically been a problem, particularly in wartime, where governments, for obvious desperate reasons, print money to pay the bills. Since the gold standard, there have been other mechanisms to try and control inflation. These probably need to be talked about a bit in class. One was the Bretton Woods system, which tied the pound to the dollar. One was the medium-term financial strategy in the 80s, which tied the government to targets for growth in the money supply, and one was the exchange rate mechanism from 1990 to 92, which pegged the pound to the German currency, the Deutschmark. Alright, as I'd said before, during the period 1997 to 2008, there was a period of historic, very, very low inflation. Given that inflation was so low in this period, from 1997 to 2008, it was called the nice decade, a decade of non-inflation, constant expansion. But we know that a financial crisis followed, so the problems of the economy certainly weren't showing up in this figure, which was very gentle, but must have been. Let's look now at what causes inflationary pressures. Well, the pressure for inflation can be summarized as coming from the demand side or the supply side. Demand pull inflation comes from an increase in aggregate demand. This pulls up prices along the axes shown on the left here. Prices being pulled up. What can cause demand pull inflation? Well, obviously increases in any of the components of demand. So consumption being, that's consumer spending, the main one. Another thing that's often listed as a cause of demand pull inflation is low unemployment. Because if unemployment falls, more people are more confident, and firms are more confident that the economy is going to grow, and more people have better money. So all those things increase demand in the economy, increase spending. Consider how a depreciation of the exchange rate, all things being equal, will cause exports to be cheaper for foreigners, so that will boost aggregate demand if exports go up. Increasing the supply of money will boost aggregate demand. More lending to people will increase aggregate demand as they have more money to spend in both cases. When the housing market booms, you tend to have people feeling that they can release money from their mortgages to spend on an extension or a new car and things like that. And of course, it creates a wealth effect. People being wealthier feel more confident and they spend more. Lower interest rates have various effects on the economy. Those various effects are known as the transmission mechanism. They generally lead to higher investment spending, higher consumer spending, and increasing aggregate demand. What about cost push inflation? Well, as you may have already predicted, that comes from shifting the supply curve to the left, an increase in costs in the economy. Note here that this causes the price level to rise, inflation, but the economy to contract, aggregate demand to fall along the curve here, output to fall. This is stagflation, all right? Negative or low growth coupled with inflation. This is a very nasty business. So, to summarise, the initial pressure for inflation is either the demand pull or cost push. But please bear in mind that the real definition of inflation is a sustained rise in the general level of prices. So for inflation to persist, then we really do need to look at what allows this demand pull, cost push thing to carry on indefinitely. And to cut a long story short, that is excessive increases in the money supply. We often look at inflation and unemployment together in economics. There are two reasons for this, really. One is that in a boom period you tend to get high inflation but low unemployment. The other is that there are direct links between the conditions of the labour market and inflation. If there is a tight labour market, very low unemployment and firms competing to get the best workers, wages will be bid up. And workers, when there's low unemployment, have strong bargaining power, so they can push up wages. Pushing up wages causes inflation. For both those direct and indirect reasons, you would expect, especially in the short run, higher unemployment to drive down inflation and lower unemployment to drive up inflation. This theoretical relationship is known as the Phillips curve. It's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Sustained growth is a key macro objective, and by growth we really mean long-run growth, which is a rise in trend GDP, which we would model in theory as an expansion of the LRAS or the PPF. And of course it means more capacity in the economy and the potential for us to consume and enjoy more goods and services. It allows for a better quality of life, but it doesn't guarantee it for all sorts of reasons that we've rehearsed before on the AS syllabus about the difference between GDP and standard of living. Although we often use the term sustained growth to mean trend, ongoing, not too volatile, we mustn't confuse that with the term sustainable, which normally means sustainable in the environmental sense. Increases in actual output, growth measured ex post, is usually modelled as aggregate demand rising. So if aggregate demand meets that growth in supply, then you have an increase in actual growth. Of course, if aggregate demand exceeds the growth in aggregate supply, you've got an unsustained boom. So here's the difference graphically depicted for you. Actual output, that's the measured GDP, can sometimes be rising faster than trend and sometimes slower than trend. And the gaps between actual and trend are the output gap that we talk about, also modelled in theory as AD being to the left or right of LRAS. Have a stop and think now about how the output gap is shown by this graph. Blue line, the actual measured GDP in the economy over time, pink line, trend GDP. And in your notes, you'll need to label the points on this graph where there's a recession, a trough, the recovery phase, a boom, and the peak. In the recessionary phase, there's a negative output gap. There are unemployed resources in the economy. In a boom, though, we call the gap an inflationary output gap. Very low unemployment, also known as a tight labour market, which causes demand pull inflation. This graph is a bit of a sneaky one because what the Institute of Fiscal Studies have done here is extrapolate the trend from 1997 to 2009 and said, well, if that trend continued, where would trend growth be? And if that trend were the trend in potential output, the growth of the economy, you can see very obviously here the intensity of the Great Recession, how steep it was, and really there's a sort of a decade of lost output from where we would have been had we not had that recession. Here's estimates by the Office of Budget Responsibility of the output gap. You can see that in the period running up to the Great Recession, the output gap was inflationary, but not very greatly. There's this sudden collapse in aggregate demand. It goes well below trend, and there's a sort of slow and unsmooth pickup to about now, where they feel we're getting closer to full employment again. This line 0 is by definition full employment. So that leads us neatly onto the topic of unemployment. There are two measures of unemployment you need to know: the claimant count, those people on benefits, and the labour force survey measure, which is a sampling technique trying to understand who's unemployed. Nowadays the government uses the labour force survey as its key figure. If you click on this, if you've got a link, or Google unemployment data, you'll find that their data is sort of interactive, which is quite helpful. Here on the graph that I can show you here, you can see that in the last year or two, unemployment's been falling. So although it jumped with the Great Recession, it's really fallen quite happily down to a lowish level of 5.5%. In that period of the Great Recession, you can see that unemployment rates in Britain really affected your age group much worse than everybody else. The macro objective full employment is a difficult one to define. After all, economists understand full employment to be where the economy equilibrates, so where this Y star is the full employment level of national income. So what you need to draw on this is an aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve shifting each way to understand inflation and deflationary gaps. In the empirical sense, what is full employment? Well, it's hard to estimate quite how much the natural rate of unemployment is. It's certainly 4-5% unemployment would be close to what we think full employment is at the moment. The balance of payments accounts are just a set of accounts, some bookkeeping, that record all money that flows across borders. By definition, therefore, it's also a record of all the things which affect the supply and demand for the GB pound, our currency, because when we flow across borders, we also demand or supply foreign currency. So the balance of payments is a topic which is really connected with the exchange rate. And to help students, I often like to say that the balance of payments is just a list of all the things that would affect the exchange rate. All the things that create demand for the pound are credits and given a positive sign, and all the things which create supply of pounds are debits and given a negative sign. The main components of the balance of payments, you'll remember, are the balance of trading goods and services, the trade balance, the current income, which is the income that we get from owning investments abroad. So, for example, the profits of BP in Nigeria coming over to Britain, minus, of course, the things like Asda's profits going to Walmart in America, going the other way. That can be any income flow, not just profit. And also current transfers, nowadays called primary income for current income and secondary income for current transfers. Balance of trading goods, the balance of trading services, add together to make the trade balance, plus current income, plus current transfers, is known as the current account of the balance of payments. Here it is shown graphically. It's very, very important that you realise that recently the current account of the balance of payments has been very negative as a percentage of GDP. It's been negative for quite a long time. Different components have been positive. The balance of trade and services, this red bar here, you can see has been positive and a growing source of income for the UK. Income until recently has been a contribution to a positive contribution to the balance, current account balance. However, our goods deficit, the blue bars here, is very, very big and outweighs the surplus in services. So what is the meaning and the consequence of a current account deficit? Well, it does mean, unless income were a huge component, that there's a balance of trade deficit, so that we import more than we export. That isn't in itself a bad thing. To believe that you should always export more than you import is called the mercantilist fallacy. However, it does often suggest that we're not very productive. So our huge deficit on goods suggests we're not a very good manufacturing economy. In truth, we're not bad, but we're just not as good as Germany. It does require us, in a sense, to borrow from abroad. There's a surplus on the financial account, which means that in the future there'll be higher outflows of income. If you think of borrowing in the sense of, say, a foreign firm buying a British one, in the future the profit will flow out from the current account. Greater foreign ownership of UK assets is implicit in us running a current account deficit. Whether that's a problem or not may only be political, strategic or racist, but it's not so much an economic problem, although it does of course indicate that we're a debtor nation. In the future it may require higher interest rates in order to maintain the value of the pound. So, lots of topics covered, a little bit of theory covered, and hopefully a prompt to fill in the notes and think about the data that I've given you, and also getting more data to understand where the British economy is now and where it's planning to go.